Howdy, Brian.
How are you doing today, sir?
Great. Thank you. How are you?
Doing good?
What I thought we'd talk about today, and maybe it's just a jumping off point to something else, as a dialogic conversation can sometimes do. Um, I've been thinking. So I was talking to a contracting company about a software implementation that they were doing, and basically they were experiencing a tension because there was this need to both move fast and slow. They needed to be careful and make sure that they were choosing their kind of deployment opportunities for the software carefully and methodically and evaluating the feedback loops before they try something else. And at the same time, there are ways where they see that they could make a big impact if they stepped outside of their typical processes and took more risk, maybe. Um, and it made me think about fast and slow, generalist and specialist, kind of a lot of the binaries that show up in the business world through the lens of kind of how we talk about um, dependence, independence, interdependence, which I think we did an episode on in the past.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so some of what they're dealing with is as as a contracting company, as a monolith, they're kind of bound to to move slow, like an armada is bound to move slow. But any single little ship in the armada, like a scouting ship, can move quickly, or any single sub team within one function within the company overall could make fast decisions and deploy software quickly on a specific use case to have a specific impact. And so individually and collectively, I think we experience this tension. And I think there's like a psychological um thing to it also about um I don't know, maybe it's just how we think about risk and opportunity. But then there's also this individualistic versus collectivist tension that we experience. So there's kind of like a tangle of sort of business topics, but that I thought fit here in some way also. And so let's see if that's a jumping off point and what comes up for you.
Yeah. Well, let's see. The things that leapt out there for me is that we talked about our height before we talked about our height being limited by the breadth of our base. And this feels like a breadth of the base kind of a topic in a certain way. And the the thing, if we keep pushing that analogy, the thing that makes the base broad is the fact that you have elements that are pretty far apart, yet somehow they're integrated into the same structure. You have the leg out on the right side, you got the leg out on the left side. Um,
Say
um,
in an organization, sales and operations,
yeah,
for
and you better
example.
have another leg in there somewhere.
Finest.
Yeah, and but so then you get into this. You actually get into a lot of these interesting philosophical kind of issues if we think about it the most generic way, right? Because here we have two things. One is a left leg, one is a right leg. By definition, they're supposed to be doing different things, but by definition, they're also supposed to be part of the same elephant. And so you have, if they're too much the same, you get a monolithic result. If they're too much different, you get a fragmented, not holding the same goal kind of result. So you have, I suppose, presumably, if we were to follow the traditional formulas, that would make us pose a third element that operates as the integration of the two somehow. Either
Like in
in
a
that,
dialectic kind of way, or
yeah,
because I'm
yeah,
now thinking of this as like a what you're describing is kind of the nature of any collective, right? And and are you saying there always needs to be a third thing to harmonize or integrate or
yeah,
manage the
hmm
polarities?
yeah. And that you might have a lot of different pairs of polarities within any undertaking or organization. And so, though that third function might be what we traditionally call management, but I sort of, I don't know. I always come back to things on the smaller side of this, on the smaller end of the scale, and think that somehow the whole undertaking has to be able to live in one mind, and hopefully in the mind of several founders, right, or people that are midwifing the vision, if you will, and that has to have the component that ultimately sews all of these diverse elements together into a unity.
Let's let's drill down on that because the way you presented it sounded like you're not sure maybe if that's just a bias you have or if there's a foundation under that. Can we expound on it some? So is the danger that if no single individual or small group of individuals, like a cabal, um, owns the entirety of the vision, is the danger that the vision can get a life of its own?
That's probably one of the many dangers. I think of this interesting idea that I think mostly shows up in contract law, which is called a meeting of the minds, right? And the contract is supposed to stipulate all the particulars, but they're the particulars of this meeting of the minds. On your side, your expectation is to get your house painted and it cost you several $100s. And on the other side, the expectation is to have to paint a house and to be compensated for it by several $100s. And this idea that as long as we agree on the details, we're holding enough of the same vision that our transaction, our relationship can continue and not go off the rails. And this idea of a meeting of the minds sort of establishes the specifics within that contract, that relationship. Well, it seems to me that we don't use the same languaging, maybe, but it seems to me that when we're talking about uh, the holding of a mission or a vision within a corporation, what you're really talking about is a meeting of the minds on steroids. And while we want the people that are focused on running the warehouse to have their vision taken up mostly with warehouse items, and we want the bookkeeping people mostly focused on the keeping of books, we want there to be some definite overlap that says that we as a unit are doing this thing out of this identity that we share together, that which is the boat moving in a certain direction. I'm pulling on this oar over here and you're pulling on this oar over there, or plugging a hole, or you know some other boat business. But the idea is that there's one boat and it's going in one direction. You can tell
Desert
I have
folk.
a lot of boat business analogies just at my fingertips. Um, Trim the yard arms or whatever it is. So, so And I think that what happens is this is a question that we came up with. It's a version of the same question when we have different cultures meet, and we say one is high trust, low kinship, and the other is low trust, high kinship. So this is a version of what we call universalist or particularist, which we've spoken of before. So a person comes in to work with a company. They're typically kind of particularist, right? And the way that shows up, stretching the metaphor into this setting, is they want to know the hours that they're going to have to work. They're going to want to know about their benefit package and vacation time. They don't really care about the boss's vacation time. Not if they do, it's only secondarily and way down the list. But they want to know the cost benefit analysis as it affects them and their agenda. And what every employer hopes is that they can have these employees somewhat share some degree of universalist value system with all the other people working for the company. And often at the beginning, they try, and which I don't think is particularly wise, is part of their onboarding is, okay, we're interviewing you. Tell us why you already want to take on our mission. Well, I've always wanted to make better tires. And so I, ever since I was a child, I dreamt of and in fact, one would hope that loyalty to a vision would come more organically through an actual interaction with the way that vision is manifesting and in actual interactions with the people that are trying to make that vision happen. And then you find out it may fit, it may not fit. Right. So, and this is, I guess, another also one of the dangers of ideology, because if you really hold a vision, it's not just an ideology. It's like a good reason to spend a bunch of the hours of your life in a regular undertaking, right?
Yeah, it's funny that I questioned at the beginning whether this might be a jumping off point because the before we hit record, I said I was pulled in a couple of directions, and the other direction I was getting pulled in, which seemed like maybe too general, and I couldn't quite get a handle on it, was what the heck is collective psychology anyway? And I think we've touched on that before also, but it's not the sum of individual psychology. It's its own thing. And it's related to this thing I keep thinking about that people don't have ideas, ideas have people. Or you could pose that as a question that
Hmm.
what if um, people don't have ideas, but ideas have people? And what that means collectively gets pretty tough to nail down. And you're kind of getting to, I started with moving fast and slow at the same time and sort of balancing um, uh, um, let's say capability within an organization, but we quickly got to uh, all the mushiness around what it means to row the same boat in the same direction, not just in an organization, but amongst any two people, amongst the smallest possible collective. Even that gets pretty dicey pretty quick. So yeah,
Right.
interesting. And maybe I'll just bring in that like collective psychology idea and the idea of ideas having people and the difficulty of sharing a reality, all being interrelated ideas, just to
Right.
kind of blow
Right.
this up a little more.
Well, it's interesting. I saw this, I watched this video, uh, and they were talking about how come prehistoric people didn't have laws and jails and police and meter maids and all these things that we have to kind of keep everybody on the same page and running in the same grooves, so to speak. And one of the things that they were pointing out was that in our earliest social form, which we occupied for countless millennia, if we go back to the beginning of so-called modern humans, uh, and that what they pointed out was that the individual was rarely, if ever, really alone. And so that their their behavior was more immediately regulated by the group. And what you were doing was very much, to do with what the group is doing. Even if you had accumulated, influence within the group to the point where you were deciding what the group was doing. Are we going to hunt seals? Or are we going to go hunt walruses or whatever it still was all about this group idea. And you could see it as a more or less modern, in the big picture, a modern idea that a person might go about things with their own complete individualized agendas, develop their own strategy for how they're going to stay alive in life. It's like, well, I thought I would, which is very different than saying, okay, it's this moon. We go hunt this animal now and we all do it together. And it's all so in a certain sense, you might say that when we stopped co-supervising and co-regulating each other, what is the thing that went along with us that sort of encouraged that action at a distance, if you will? Then it would be, I guess you'd say it was these ideas started doing it, right? You weren't with the group, but you were with the idea of the group, and the ideas that the group carried went with you. Whether those were, supernatural or just identity as part of the group or.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that that's different from the kind of close up and personal co-regulation that you're talking about. I think that's also a transmission of uh, a, a a shared set of ideas.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
maybe the literalness, maybe that's where symbols start to come in to represent the ideas. It's not that the
Yep.
ideas are new, but maybe how they're transmitted evolves.
O or the ideas now live without another person there speaking them or representing them. A child at one age, they say, "Well, mom is gone." That means that the cookies are fair game.
I still say that.
Well, exactly. And at another point, though, there's at least another voice in your head that says, maybe in the future this will come back and revisit me. But that's an idea, right? And it's an idea that at one age you didn't have it. And you literally will stand there with the cookies smeared all over your face and go, must be the dog, right? And, uh, so we cross a boundary, though, and maybe that boundary is where those ideas start to live with us. They start to carry into the future a little bit. Maybe now we have ideal permanence and not just object permanence. I can remember when I was a lot older than facing dilemmas with cookies, uh, playing the music really loud. And my father commuted, far away, and he wasn't back before a certain hour. And uh, he showed up in the midst of a banging jam and absolutely did not appreciate it in the least, and experienced or manifested a certain amount of emotional dysregulation in his expression of his lack of appreciation for this particular style of music, which was a thing that generation did. and but the shitstorm that unleashed, I still kind of
You're
feel
saying that it wasn't
you
just
know,
that you had the music on loud. It was also that the new music represented a conflicting set of ideals with the set of ideals that your father and his generation kind of adhered to,
but what I'm
espoused.
really saying is that his response, the idea of his response, lived in my nervous system for years after
I
that.
see. Yeah,
And whenever I would turn up the music, where I was the authority, the sole authority of how loud the music would be, I still that had that little kind of thing living
yeah,
there.
yeah.
And for years I had to go "Rrr," and I'd turn it up a little more, right? Just to show the and um so so this idea that psychologically somehow these social ideas come to live within us. And that's Heidegger's Das Man, right? We didn't choose it. In fact, it chafes, but it still comes to have some sort of a constraint in our behavior. And if we give into it too much, it makes us inauthentic. Can't remember the German for that, but it
Yeah,
sounds very
or maybe
authoritarian.
another way of framing that is that kind of like the collective ideas that help create the cognitive world and presumably keep us safe, at least as far as the collective model of the cognitive world defines safety or understands safety. We also have to strain against it in order to discover ourselves and expand the cognitive model for the collective.
Right. Well, and there's a kind of an Overton window to that. One of the favorite things I've seen recently has been when Europeans have come to America. This was, again, a YouTube thing you probably wouldn't have seen until the invention of YouTube, uh, where they came and they saw a rodeo. And particularly, they saw the kids' competition of the rodeo. And I admit it helped me look at it through their eyes. And it looks pretty crazy. It's like, yeah, let's strap that kid on that livestock and get her going. you know, and then the gets going, and they come out. And Americans have been doing this forever, and everybody, with a very few exceptions, has come out stronger and better for it. You know, I presume there are exceptions out there.
I think I know a couple. Yeah.
yeah, but Uh, but it is that idea of a sort of an Overton window, which is, where do we draw the line? How do we go about things? And this is all that communication idea, right? So if an organization is like a clown on a unicycle, and one set of problems represents falling off the unicycle in one idea, and another set of problems represents falling, right? Now you've jobbed
Or
out.
let's be more specific. Maybe falling off the unicycle in one direction is acting too much like a collective, and falling off on the other direction is acting too fragmented.
Sure, sure. I think a lot of polarities would fit in there. Spending too much money too fast, spending too little money too slow, or there's a lot of decisions that would fit in there. But you end up with people within the organization, and like my job is to represent the voice that says we don't want to lean too far over in this direction. And then there's somebody else in the organization likely who manifests the voice that says it's this other direction that we also don't want to lean too far over in. And then somebody, I like to think of Captain Kirk as, a Captain Consciousness, and he's got he's got the different voices, and he's, let's crush them, Captain. And like, no, there's people down there, Jim, and they go through all that inner dialogue where these two horizons have to be fused in a decision. Come back to one of our other one-string banjo songs. So, that happens as a in a relationship between two people, or it happens as the interrelationship between two components speaking for the different aspects of this collective concern.
So bring back your idea from earlier about there has to be a third party to integrate the two polarities. So with this clown on the unicycle idea, or sales represents growth and operations represents capacity, and their intention with one another. Um, how do you envision this third thing, and what does it existing look like?
I think it looks like a board of directors that shares and understands the vision, uh, and understands that their ability to grasp the situation, communicate the areas that speak to them based on their individual expertise, and to bring that to the meeting of the minds. That is to say that the boardroom, in some sense, should be the room. It's in the middle of the boardroom conference table that the phonograph sits. And everybody sitting around that table is seeing the same phonograph record, but they're reading a slightly different back and forth on it. And it's their communication of the reality of their own viewpoints and their understanding of the relative nature of their viewpoints in assimilating into the collective intelligence of the enterprise. And I suspect that I haven't seen every board of directors operate, but I used to work for a board of directors. And so I got used to speaking to this beast with many minds and to understand the different interests that each one brought to the table, quite literally. And so it really is. I mean, then you have downwind or downstream communications from that. But I think that the real magic has to happen in the way that all those viewpoints around the boardroom table assimilate and generate a sort of a holographic third dimension to see the phonograph from.
I mean, that's a incredibly uh, compelling start to an argument for why executive functions in companies and organizations should practice dialogue, because you kind of you're describing a synthesis of a variety of synthesizing perspectives that have the potential to synthesize in different ways and come out with different results. And you want the synthesis of those even. So that's your Captain Kirk function.
And it has to be a group that I think can easily and professionally switch from the generative type of conversation to the, I don't want to call it debate, but
Decision making.
It's a convergent thing, or it becomes a different project psychologically of ruling out and ruling in. And but I think that you can't have that conversation productively until you've had the generative one. And that the generative one both lays out the landscape and it also lays out potential futures of ways that landscape could unfold. And then maybe when you get down from the strategy to the tactics, maybe that's where your convergent conversations need to start happening. and
I
and
think it even happens at the level of making a decision about what is the strategy, because you end up with competing ideas of the possible future states,
right,
and competing uh, perspectives on what's important, what's more and less important amongst the variables that
right,
drive those future
right.
states. And at some point, you have to make decisions about how to integrate that, or make sense of it enough so that decisions can result. And that's always a pivot in the strategic conversation.
And
But you have to
that's
make
always
decisions to have a strategy.
and that's where I think a really a board that knows its business knows who to bring in to speak to the board. Like I was the when I worked for a board of directors, I was operating a system on their behalf. So they relied on my both awareness of the landscape, the real landscape that they were facing, and the mechanical, technical choices. And, once you've made this choice, it turns out you might have made other choices without realizing it, and things like that, that from a technical standpoint, they would maybe not have grasped. Because, I don't know is not only a valid response to an important question, it's also a statement of a dispositional condition. And maybe the best statement would be, "I don't know yet," because that indicates that with more specificity that the disposition is one of attaining the data before arriving at a conclusion. I can't answer it, but I know the three places to look, or, some such thing. And that's why, because we get into two other things that we haven't talked about, it isn't just about the intelligence and knowing the, the territory, it's also about authority and responsibility, right? These two things often should be flapping very close by each other in the flock. Uh, if authority and responsibility start to separate too far, you get other problems. In fact, I remember years ago, I saw this when I first started in the mechanical field, and it said it was a poem, and it was about the railroad, and the last line was something like, "I don't get to toot the whistle, I don't get to ring the bell, but when the damn thing jumps the track, I'm the one that catches hell." And so, when you look at, from an operational standpoint, this is where the board, uh, by virtue of its oversight and its supervision, right? Both of these are kind of over, implying a sort of an awayness from the where the rubber meets the road, as Werner used to like to say. Um, there's a danger of them seeing an idea in their head instead of understanding the actual thing itself. And so that's where, if you want to decide those debates, the danger is, do you answer those debates ideologically or pragmatically? Pragmatism is something that we're sort of, because it's a uniquely American uh, movement. It's something that we've given a little more attention to, and will continue to. In fact, I just arrived William James's work on pragmatism, which I think is going to be the next one that we do as a reading. And uh, but it's this idea that we have to understand our ideas based on what they do. And that's what a board really comes together for, is to answer the question, what should we do? And if a board doesn't resolve to do something in a board meeting, it really hasn't achieved much, right? I mean, you could maybe rate the productivity of a board based on its resolutions somehow, right?
I don't think that's true for all boards. And I don't mean to split hairs, but when you have a very high functioning leadership team, then a board's role can be simply as thought partners
Well, steady
and
as she goes is an official action, actually,
okay.
basically, because it's a taking of responsibility, right? And that might be the other part of that formula with a board. Is a board having the ultimate supervisory capacity also is where the legal uh, birds come home to roost as well, right? Typically. Uh, so there is something, and I do think that there are operations, yeah, that might get to the steady as she goes, or maybe most of their decisions are personnel, and then purely listening. But the idea of the power that resides in a board lies in its power to make resolutions. And those resolutions don't just determine policy, but they determine actions, right? Which hopefully are based on policy. But but the critical connection that I'm after here is that the ideas have to translate to actions. And that it's those actions that represent the result of the work that's been done in harmonizing those different polarities, right? Do we go left, right, or hold? And we have this idea of making informed decisions. And that's kind of implied with that informed, in that, it got weighed this way, it got weighed that way, it got investigated from all of the what's the buzzword, stakeholders. And uh, because, and I say a buzzword because when enterprises get to a certain size, there's no one that's not a stakeholder, right? So,
Well, that's this stakeholder replacing shareholder is let's say a dog whistle for um, uh, the what some folks refer to as the new economic world order, right? The Davos conference is all about stakeholder capitalism instead
stakeholder.
of so a corporation has to account for um, everybody who might be impacted by the corporation's activities. And in some sense, I mean, that's another clown on the unicycle topic, because in some sense that must be true. And in another sense, what a disaster of both red tape and incentive confusion for every entity to try to take into account infinite complexity. So yeah, that's why I chuckled when you referred to it as a buzzword, because that's a loaded buzzword that means
It
different
is,
things in
right?
different
Well,
contexts.
and it also sort of underlies the elegance of the small is beautiful idea. Things are trackable at a certain scale, at a human scale, and it's when they go beyond a certain human scale that we find ourselves, oh my god.
And again, on the other side of that unicycle ride is some things that have been tremendously valuable for humankind are not possible at a small scale.
Right, right.
So like connecting everybody in the world with fiber optics um, is definitely a big project. Um,
Or building the pyramids or the Great Wall. But what if you know that routine, right? What if all the really good stuff that we were able to achieve happened through slavery? I think that
yeah.
was the the Louis
What if
CK.
there's a downside? Yeah, was that
Yeah,
a Louis CK? Yeah, that
yeah.
figures.
But
Um,
what if? Not that I'm saying this, but what if?
yeah.
Uh, yeah, and you get into all of those means justifying the ends or not types of conversations, and this is like another backdoor into pragmatism. and what exactly does it mean as a philosophy, as opposed to saying like, oh yeah, Joe, he's really pragmatic, he hit it with the wrench or whatever.
I wondered if you would talk a little more about, and this is like zooming out a little, but pragmatism is sort of a uniquely American ideology. And what does that mean for how we might expect, on average, American organizations to behave differently?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The American pragmatic movement, there's two halves to it. And one is who I've mentioned before, William James, one of the fathers of American psychology, wrote the Harvard textbook, The Principles of Psychology, first Harvard textbook on psychology, at short, 1910, something like that, 110 plus years ago. But there's another guy, Pierce, who wrote before him, and I think at least partly inspired him, and I think they were buddies, and then they had a falling out. So William James is responsible for what we call pragmatism, and Pierce is responsible for what we call pragmaticism.
Sounds like we're splitting hairs here.
Well, he took that word. I think maybe he started with the word pragmatism and found that it got hijacked. And so I think he said something to the effect of, if he uses the word pragmaticism, that it's too inelegant for anyone else to steal. And I think kind of maybe
Yeah.
pointing at William James to do all this, and I don't know all the details, which is why I'm looking forward to reading this book for the audio bookshelf, because a lot of these I'm familiar with, but I haven't either read recently or gotten all the details or remembered them all or any of that. So I'm looking forward to this, and I'm also considering. We did. John Dewey, who also is associated with the pragmatist philosophy and came a little bit later. And he's got some some ideas about education that I think have generated the world that modern corporations have come up in and been developed in. So he's had an influence on a lot of people that don't know his name and aren't aware of where he shows up. But this learning by doing is basically John Dewey.
Okay. I mean, I was hoping you would say more specifically, um, more specific things about pragmatism and how an American organization might behave differently from a not American organization. But
Right.
if you want to punt that, I wonder if coming back to this kind of bigger, weirder question of what is collective psychology, and I I want to say, as a straw man at least, that it's something like the shared, um, the ways in which our feet are nailed down in a particular room in a particular house in a common way that
Mhm.
creates a common set of beliefs, or as you preferred in a recent episode, a common world, a common reality.
Right. Right.
Um, but no individual might have a complete picture of that, and that's one of the ways it gets weird.
Mhm.
And no individual might fully adhere to it, and that's another way it gets weird.
And
So
it changes over time.
yeah, but it's kind of ephemeral, and I'm wondering if we can define it, or maybe more than define it, give examples of how it shows up in our
Right.
lives that
Well,
make it more relatable.
the defining idea of pragmatism is to know an idea by its so-called cash value. And I think that's a William James idea. And for example, I think a good example comes out of the life of William James, where, I think I mentioned before that he suffered the sickness of determinist philosophy. and was in question about the reality of free will. And he read the work of a French philosopher whose name escapes me, which sort of turned him around because he was in a serious depression. And we've mentioned this before. It's kind of the overlay of philosophy and psychology, um, and so long and short of it, he came out of that encounter having decided that he would act as if free will existed.
Like Jordan Peterson acting as if God exists.
And you can see where the argument would be made, well, things are just going to work out better if I do that, which we start to get very close to what Plato referred to as the noble lie.
And I wonder if he
Like
believed he made that choice, because that
the choice
obviously
for free will.
the choice to act as if free will exists seems
I
like an
think
act of free will.
he thought of that as his first conscious act of free will, I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But you could see where one could see that there is a certain practicality in seeing what, like Sun Bear and his famous quote, good ideas are nice, but they don't all grow corn. Native
That's what I thought you
American
meant by the cash value of an idea.
probably never read James. Maybe he did. I don't know. But he didn't need to, because as an American, that just makes horse sense, and uh, other nationalities, maybe they don't get sense from livestock, but it's an American thing.
I hear New Zealanders do. At least that's what the Australians say.
Yeah, that could be. And but horse sense in the see, and again, this is it maybe makes sense for a frontier people where you rely a lot on your hands-on skills. Uh, in a place of wide open spaces, there isn't always someone who's an expert that you can subcontract your necessity to. So that maybe sort of makes Americans a kind of a hands-on, there's nobody else going to do it if you don't do it. And the environment is intense enough that if you don't do something, you're not going to be here to have the problem that long. So you get the urgency and the necessity being the mother of invention, right? Today's rock and roll reference.
Zappa?
Frank, Frank and the Mothers. And but so when you're that close to the fight for survival, the idea that ideas are the things that will save you, it sits differently. So that you maybe develop a different way of thinking that is about um uh you were probably too young to remember Felix the cat. Did you ever hear of Felix the cat?
Yeah. Um, he was the one with the Tweety Bird situation, right?
No, no, this is before that. This was black and white. This is the one that had the bag of tricks.
Okay.
And he had a very snappy theme song. I'm sure now with YouTube, there's Felix the Cat cartoons out there. And if you
I think
don't,
I have seen him. I just haven't watched cartoons in a very long time, so I might be getting my
right. Well, he
characters
would
confused.
he would, go and have adventures and encounter various and sundry shenanigans. And he would get in a fix regularly.
A pickle.
Well, in this case, it was right in there with the theme song. Felix the cat, the wonderful, wonderful cat. Whenever he gets in a fix, he reaches into his bag of tricks, Felix the cat, right? Well, I kind of think of the American approach to logic as kind of coming out of that Felix the cat in a fix kind of an environment. And if you think about this, see one of the ways to understand the Americans is to sort of juxtapose them with the continent and continental philosophy, which in some sense you could say it was a reaction to. A lot of things were a reaction to that, to the German idealists. Okay, now if and I have been, as I might have confessed recently, trying to make my way through Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. And folks, if you value your time, don't 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 try this at home. Just go watch a video on it from a professor. Other philosophers that came later argued that it's complete and total nonsense, just drivel from beginning to end. And Schopenhauer, most notably. But the problem with it is one that Nietzsche, in criticizing Kant, who was the first one of these to start this sort of thing, and Hegel and the whole bunch of them, in a book he wrote called Beyond Good and Evil, which is a much easier read than Zarathustra. He said so the thing that goes on with Kant is he wrote this whole huge, fat, complicated book that's not entirely nonsense like a lot of Hegel is, called The Critique of Pure Reason. And he ultimately is asking the question, how does inductive reasoning work? Deductive reasoning is pretty straightforward and makes sense. Inductive reasoning is more complicated and technically is not something we really can do. If you're not clear on that for our listeners, this is one of the things that maybe AI will be interesting. Ask AI to explain to you the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. So Kant writes this whole book looking at how humans do this and by what means do they do it. And the conclusion that he comes to at the end is by means of a faculty which enables us to do it. And Nietzsche, that just is the final straw for Nietzsche. And he just rips him for that. And he makes reference to a play by Molière, where someone asks a doctor, how is it that opium makes the patient sleep? And the doctor, very educatedly and superiorly, and he explains that the opium puts the patient to sleep by virtue of a what did he call it? A somnolent compound, or basically, in other words, he made up a Latin word that said because of something that makes you go to sleep. And what he did was, those of us that saw our episode with Ken Leong, he mentioned it. The official error is called reification. He just created something out of thin air by languaging it. And he said, that's like, how do we do it? By creation of a faculty. Well, now all of a sudden this faculty exists where there wasn't faculty before. He just decided that since we can do it, there must be a faculty to do it, which we're not any smarter about anything after that than we were before it. And so Nietzsche calls this la naïserie allemande, which is a term in French, right? Allemande is German, and naïserie means like a nausea. So he calls this the German nausea. And he says, now, ever since then, every German philosopher has gone off into the shrubs to discover faculties because can explain anything, can make anything just out of language, right? Well, that's like an idealism thing. And when philosophers talk about idealism, they don't mean being moralistic or doing good to your neighbor, stuff like that. When we say a person's idealistic, we don't mean the same thing in common parlance. Idealism means that that you've got a tradition that's building thoughts out of other thoughts, and then more thoughts out of those thoughts, and then more thoughts, and they don't frequently do what we've now referred to as touch grass. So they build all of these systems out of language, and all the German philosophers are kind of guilty of this. And so you get, I don't have him here, but I could just read you a paragraph of Hegel and you'd know what I mean.
I'm sorry, Brian. I thought idealism in the philosophical lexicon referred to kind of the opposite of materialism, meaning that maybe not philosophical context, maybe ontological is the right category here, where an idealistic ideology proposes that mind is fundamental, or ideas are fundamental to reality, and a materialistic ideology uh, presupposes that physical reality is fundamental to consciousness. I thought idealism and materialism were sort of that duality.
They are. And,
Okay, is
and
that the
that's
same idealism that you're defining?
that's what I'm describing.
Okay.
But I'm describing way over scraping on the guardrail.
Hmm.
And these are the critiques that people give of that idealism, is that they start to live in a world that's made up of their ideas. Uh, Aristotle had the same bone to pick with Plato.
Hmm.
He was not so into the eidos. He was into actual things, which is why in the School of
Right.
Athens, he's
We talked
pointing
about
to
that criticism. Yeah.
yeah. And so there is obviously, if we didn't take ideas out of the things we see, we couldn't identify patterns. We couldn't do distillations of meaning out of things. But there is a point where we've lost sight of shore, and any kind of thing can start to make sense. Or we can keep following that thread and end up where anything can mean anything. And now we've sort of disappeared up our own wazoo, right? And so that's the danger of this idealism. Or what else is a good example of the hyper idealistic thing is the book by Hermann Hesse, Der Glasperlenspiel, the glass bead game, and the Castalians, right? The Castalians are so caught up in the glass bead game, which is a representation of all of reality and human culture, but they're so tied up in the world around this representation that they're not in touch with real reality anymore. And so there's a that it's a danger of hyper intellectualism. It's the danger um, of the mechanism of the mind no longer empowering an embodied life, but actually sort of empowering a disembodied, uh, uh, a disembodied worldview, really.
Back to
Um,
ideas having people.
yeah, and I think that's also where, like I will every so often, when I want to understand about a philosophy. I think the last one I did this with might have been one of the postmodernists. And the question was, okay, so what was this guy's life like? Was it a trail of wreckage? Was it one train wreck
I
from
read
the end?
something about what Karl Marx's life was like not too long ago, and it was illuminating.
Right. And so that, it's like, do I really get the image of somebody that has pierced the veil here? Or do I have somebody that has just tilted windmills and had their butts handed to them? And there's a lot to be said for that. That's why one of my teachers in internal arts, he says, you don't just look at what a master says, you also want to look at how do they die.
Mm.
How did the masters who had been doing those practices live or die?
And now we're not talking about like a dog in the street per se, although that could be part of the formula.
That could be a dimension of it, but it could be,
We're also talking about wisdom and peace, and whatever
there were
goes
some
with that. Like, did their ideology grow corn?
right, and what kind of corn? And, there's some very renowned spiritual teachers who were raging alcoholics and had short lives because of that. And, uh, which doesn't mean that their lives didn't discover or uncover any truth, but it does mean that there was some dynamic maybe to the body and the manifestation and balancing that all out and desire and, controlling our own behavior and, there were some elements that escaped them.
We've heard the same said about when you visit a medical doctor, their physical condition ought to give you some indication of their competence, right?
Right. Do you really want a bookkeeper who's broke, you know, or an attorney who's just getting out of jail? Or, I mean, I suppose we could, there's a lot of these. You are talking about I mean, in the broadest sense, if wisdom is, I have it up on here, the ability to discern and apply universal principles and values that foster personal growth, well-being, and the greater good. So that
Universal
gives you a
principles is interesting because I have been thinking of it more and more as dispositional.
right, right. And this really does not, well, discern and apply.
Yeah,
So it doesn't really it doesn't really
it's
have that
scratching the surface.
embodied. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's feeling more like Sophia and less like phronesis.
yeah.
Yeah. And but we're really talking about like, okay, well, what kind of flowers grow out of this mix? And that, that's an old idea, knowing the tree by its fruit. Well, that's in essence pragmatism, right? It's like if my ideas are good, and it's also Aristotle, if I'm pursuing real phronesis, then I'm going to get to eudaimonia, which is to say the good life. Then I'm actually going to experience the fruits of virtue. And which is an idea that I think you don't have to go through too much mental gymnastics to see there's a certain logical sense there. Uh, you know a tree by its fruit. You understand the results of something by doing it or watching it done and see what happens. You know, uh, so but I mean, I guess there we are limited by our grasp of what the good life is, and Aristotle goes through that too. This is all Nicomachean ethics, folks. Um, which is, one of these fundamental works of Western civilization that we find ourselves coming back to regularly, like it or not, because this guy had a lot on the screen. Um, but so, yeah, what is the software that I run, both individually and collectively? I mean, because we can extend that. If wisdom is this idea of applying and discerning and applying universal principles and values that foster personal growth, well-being, and the greater good, then we could define what a wise corporation is. And it wouldn't look that different, right? It would be a corporation with the ability to discern and apply universal principles and that values and fosters personal growth, well being, and the greater good. And it doesn't really mention shareholders in there, except in the greater good, and I guess in the participation in an enterprise of wisdom.
Maybe this is a transition to our next episode, so we should put a pin in this. But
Mhm.
I read I guess it was like a short form piece, like just a couple paragraphs about how um that fundamental to communism is the belief that people are fundamentally good and left to their own devices will cooperate for the common good. And fundamental to the belief to the um, system of capitalism is the belief that people are fundamentally self-interested, which isn't to say bad, but where good, I should have said collaborative with communism. Self-interested would be like the fundamental economic driver of individual behavior that capitalism presupposes. And so the art of capitalism is to incentivize um, uh, well mannered self interest, which doesn't mean it always aligns with collaborative interest or collective well being, but it aligns more with um, productivity than destruction. Whereas assuming that human beings are fundamentally collaborative and neglecting to incentivize productive self interest um, only ends up inadvertently incentivizing um, destructive behavior, totalitarianism, for example. Um, so I thought that was kind of an interesting critique, and I think it's I don't know that we have time to unpack that now, but with what you just said, I thought that was a good segue to, well, what does this mean i- uh, in terms of what's our best understanding of the best way to live together at scale, not in the small is beautiful utopia, but in today's reality.
Right. Right.
Oh,
Well, that's where that I think that that's where the work in Africa I think really helped me understand it, and I also have found the work of Francis Fukuyama, who was the guy that came up with the distinction of low trust, high kinship, high trust, low kinship. Uh, which again, it gets into identity and belonging and larger contexts and value systems and reinforcements and yeah, all that, which
yeah,
explains a lot. I did have a lot of ahas around that, having seen it, from the outside.
yeah, and maybe we should talk more about Uganda.
Yeah, at some point, I think that's appropriate. I'm hoping to come to some resolutions here to some of the things, and then we could do a whole conversation about that because it's definitely an educational thing and very relevant to kind of where the world is at now. So we put it on the list for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brian.
See you next time.